So I want you to just picture a canvas for a second. It's covered in these really aggressive, almost violent slashes of paint.
Right.
And for decades, it just hangs on walls, gets traded behind closed doors, until eventually a billionaire hands over $300 million to own it.
Yeah, which is just an unfathomable amount of money.
It really is. And that price tag, it suggests a certain kind of creator, right? Like someone born into elite society, maybe groomed in the finest European academies, operating at the absolute highest echelons of culture.
You would think so, yeah.
But the hands that actually painted that $300 million masterpiece belonged to a guy who, not that long before, was literally painting houses in Hoboken just to afford a sandwich.
It's incredible.
A guy who, he snuck into America hiding in the dark hull of a British freighter.
The contrast is just, it's almost impossible to believe. You have this trajectory from absolute gritty obscurity. A working class immigrant who couldn't even speak a word of English when he arrived.
Wow.
To a man who completely dictated the terms of 20th century modern art. And we are diving into the sources today on Willem de Kooning. And I have to say, the story here goes so far beyond just, looking at paint on a canvas.
Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Yeah.
For you listening right now, our mission today is to really figure out how that stowaway house painter accidentally became one of the most defining and, well, astronomically expensive figures in history.
Yeah, and to really get a grasp on this, I want you to mentally set the scene for the world he actually operated in. Like, totally forget pristine museum galleries.
Okay, no museums.
Right. Picture a freezing mid-century New York artist's loft. The floor is just caked in dried enamel. The air is thick with the smell of cheap turpentine and stale cigarette smoke.
Very gritty.
Exactly. That environment is crucial because we aren't just going to catalog his famous works today. We are going to dig into the mechanics of his art, the turbulence of his mind, and, why his specific brand of rule-breaking changed everything.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we want to understand the high art titan, we really have to start with his highly irregular arrival in America.
Highly irregular is a good way to put it.
Let's put this in a modern context for a second. It would be like someone today sneaking past security, hiding in the landing gear of an international flight with the singular dream of, drawing superhero comic books.
Right, yeah.
And then somehow accidentally inventing an entirely new, dominant fine art movement. Why was he on a boat to begin with?
Well, he was born in Rotterdam in the Netherlands back in 1904, and his background was thoroughly working class. By 1916, when he was just 12 years old, he had already left formal schooling.
Right, 12?
Yeah, 12. He took an apprenticeship at a firm of commercial artists and decorators. He did eventually take evening classes at an Academy of Fine Arts, but he was fundamentally a tradesman early on.
Which sets the stage for 1926. He decides to cross the Atlantic, but he doesn't exactly buy a ticket.
No, not at all. He stows away on a British freighter called the Shelley. And what makes this even more chaotic is that he actually thought the ship was bound for Argentina.
You're kidding.
Nope. Instead, he ends up docking in Newport News, Virginia. And his ambition at this point, it had nothing to do with high art or hanging in the Louvre. His dream was to be an illustrator for pulp magazines.
Wait, pulp magazines? Like those cheap, sensational dime store detective and sci-fi stories?
That is exactly what he wanted. He explicitly stated later in life that American commercial illustrators were the artists who inspired him the most.
That's wild.
He wanted to be part of that fast-paced commercial world, but, the reality of being an undocumented immigrant hits him pretty hard.
I can imagine.
He makes his way up to Hoboken, New Jersey, finds lodging at a Dutch seaman's home, and simply has to survive. So he falls back on his trades. He becomes a house painter.
Just painting walls.
Exactly. By 1927, he moves into Manhattan doing carpentry, painting walls, painting signs, just working with his hands to stay alive.
So how does a guy painting baseboards to pay for his next meal pivot to the avant-garde? Because you don't wake up one morning, put down a roller, and invent abstract expressionism.
No, you don't. It happens through community. He was still painting for himself in his free time, right? Oh. And in 1928, he makes a trip to the Woodstock Art Colony in upstate New York.
Okay.
And that environment exposed him to a totally different caliber of conversation. He meets a group of modernist painters he affectionately dubbed the Three Musketeers. That was Stuart Davis, John Graham, and Arshile Gorky.
In the materials, Gorky's name comes up constantly. It seems like their dynamic was incredibly intense.
Oh, it bordered on total obsession. Gorky became de Kooning's close friend, but also, for about a decade, he was his master. People in their circle noted that de Kooning virtually worshipped the man.
Wow.
To give you a sense of how deep this ran, around 1938, de Kooning created a drawing titled Self-Portrait with Imaginary Brother, and the brother he drew standing next to him was directly modeled on a real photograph of Arshile Gorky.
So he essentially painted himself a new family tied to his artistic ambitions.
Yes, exactly.
That is a staggering level of devotion. But, I mean, admiration doesn't pay the rent. He's still an undocumented guy in New York during the Great Depression. How was he funding this artistic awakening?
Believe it or not, the U.S. government inadvertently steps in.
Really?
Yeah. During the Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration created the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and one branch of that was the Federal Art Project, which essentially put thousands of artists on the federal payroll.
Right, I've heard of that.
So de Kooning joined the Artists Union in 1934 and was hired by the WPA the following year to design large-scale public murals.
Okay, but what kind of murals are we talking about here? Like those stoic farmers and noble factory workers you normally see from that era?
Far from it. He was working on things like the Williamsburg Federal Housing Project in Brooklyn and this massive piece called Medicine for the Hall of Pharmacy at the 1939 World's Fair.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, these works were already breaking away from traditional American realism. They were pushing into modernism, playing with abstraction. The WPA provided this crucial incubator. But then, in 1937, the rules changed. He was forced to resign from the WPA.
Let me guess. They finally checked his paperwork and realized he snuck in on a freighter.
Basically, yeah. The government passed a rule requiring citizenship for WPA workers, and de Kooning wouldn't actually become a U.S. citizen until 1962.
Oh, wow.
So overnight, his steady, reliable federal paycheck just vanished. He was completely cut off.
I have to pause here because losing your sole source of income during the Great Depression sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Oh, it was devastating.
But looking at the trajectory of his life, was getting fired actually the catalyst he needed? I mean, did losing that safety net and the obligation to paint public-facing, government-approved murals, did that force him into a corner where he had to commit fully to his own vision?
That's a really perceptive way to look at it. When you remove a public mandate, the artist only has themselves left to answer to. He was suddenly surviving entirely on his own wits,
Right.
taking private commissions, giving lessons, scraping by in his loft. It forces a kind of radical introspection. He no longer had to compromise his style for a committee. He needed to strike out completely on his own, which really required breaking free from the shadows of his mentors.
So what did that early solo work look like? Because the sources mention terms like surrealist imagery and biomorphic shapes. What does a biomorphic shape actually look like on the canvas?
Think of shapes that look organic, like living cells, amoebas, or plant forms, rather than rigid, hard-edged geometry.
Okay, got it.
In the 30s and early 40s, he was heavily borrowing from Gorky's dreamlike surrealism and Pablo Picasso's fractured forms. He was using strong colors and painting series of these solitary, almost melancholic male figures.
Right.
But the real stylistic explosion happens when he meets a younger painter named Franz Klein.
Now, Klein was famous for painting almost exclusively in black and white, right?
He was, and that restriction absolutely fascinated de Kooning. By 1946, de Kooning abandons color entirely. He begins a series of densely impacted black and white abstract.
Densely impacted.
Yeah, when art historians say densely impacted, they mean canvases that are absolutely packed with chaotic energy, forms crowded together, overlapping, leaving almost no empty space to let the eye rest.
I love this shift. Think about it like this. Painting purely in black and white after years of exploring a full palette of color, it's like a musician firing the entire orchestra, sitting down and seeing what kind of raw, visceral emotion they can beat out of a single snare drum.
Yes. Restriction forces invention. He couldn't rely on pretty colors to make the painting work. The structure and the physical brushstrokes had to carry all the weight.
Wow.
And he used cheap household enamels because he couldn't afford fine art oils. This purely monochrome phase lasted until about 1949 and made up his very first one-man show at the Charles Egan Gallery in 1948.
And this era is where we get the term Abstract Expressionism, right? How does that differ from the art movements that came right before it?
Well, the art world at the time was dominated by three massive movements. Cubism, which fractured reality into geometric planes, surrealism, which painted literal, recognizable objects in bizarre, dreamlike scenarios, and regionalism, which focused on realistic rural American life.
Okay.
De Kooning, along with friends like Jackson Pollock and Franz Kline, felt all of these were too rigid. They didn't want to paint a picture of a thing. They wanted the painting to be a record of raw, emotional, physical action.
Hence the other famous label, action painting.
Exactly.
I read that they treated a canvas not as a window to look through, but as an arena to act in.
The canvas was an arena. The process was physical, exhausting, and aggressive. De Kooning would attack the canvas with large house painter brushes, scraping paint away, slapping it back on, letting it drip.
So the painting is almost like evidence.
Yes, the final image was essentially a crime scene photograph of the physical battle he had with the materials in his studio.
Which makes his next move so baffling to me. He finally masters this abstract, non-representational action painting. He removes all recognizable objects from his work. And then, at the height of this breakthrough, he pivots back to the human figure. Why would he go backwards?
Well, he didn't see it as going backwards. He saw it as applying his new weapons to an old subject. In 1950, he begins his legendary Woman series, works like Woman the First, Woman the Third, and Woman the Sixth.
Right.
He exclusively explored the female figure, but not in a classical, serene way. These were violent, aggressive, almost terrifying portraits.
How exactly did he paint them to get that effect?
It was an agonizing process. He would paint a figure, hate it, forcefully scrape the wet paint off the canvas, leaving a smeared ghost of the image behind, and then violently paint over it again.
Oh my God.
He would repeat this for months on a single canvas. He was heavily influenced by Picasso's aggressive, penetrative way of breaking apart a figure's anatomy and the space around it.
Though looking at the timeline, the influence went both ways, right? I mean, Picasso's later works clearly show signs that he was looking over his shoulder at the raw chaos de Kooning and Pollock were unleashing in New York.
Oh, the dialogue between them was undeniable. De Kooning's Woman series shocked everyone, even his own avant-garde friends who thought figure painting was dead.
Yeah.
The influential critic Harold Rosenberg described the woman in these paintings perfectly. He wrote that she was manifested as the focus of desire, frustration, inner conflict, pleasure, and as posing problems of conception and handling as demanding as those of an engineer.
That specific word, engineer, that brings us right back to his roots in carpentry and house painting. He isn't just delicately sketching a portrait, he is constructing, demolishing, and rebuilding these figures with oil, enamel, and charcoal.
Exactly.
And these paintings didn't just sit in a vacuum. They became major historical touchstones regarding post-World War II anxieties and the emerging American feminist movement.
The female figure really became the ultimate anchor for his career. And eventually, the broader world caught on. By the end of the 1950s, this former stowaway was widely considered the most influential painter working in the world.
And the modern art market has essentially cemented that status with just unimaginable amounts of money.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's look at the numbers for a second. In 2006, the billionaire David Geffen sold Woman the Third to the hedge fund manager Stephen A. Cohen for $137.5 million.
Staggering.
And a decade later, Geffen sold a piece called Interchange for roughly $300 million. At the time, that was the highest price ever paid for a painting in human history until the Da Vinci Salvator Mundi came along.
Right.
Even recently, a piece called Untitled XXV sold at a public auction for over $66 million.
The commodification of his work is staggering. We are talking about sums of money that outstrip the GDP of small island nations spent on a single canvas.
Here is where I struggle with this, and I imagine anyone listening might feel the same. We have the gritty, desperate action painting ethos of a guy who survived by painting Hoboken kitchens. He used cheap household enamels because he couldn't afford real oil paints.
Yeah.
Now, those exact same frantic brushstrokes are traded between billionaires as ultimate status symbols. Does the sheer obscene wealth of the modern art market change how we are supposed to view the raw rebellion of the original work?
It highlights the ultimate paradox of modern art. The rebellion inevitably becomes the establishment.
Wow.
The desperate energy of a freezing New York loft gets captured, framed, and turned into a financial asset for a hedge fund portfolio. But if you look closely at the canvas, the origin isn't erased.
Yeah.
The violent scrapes of paint on Interchange were still applied by a man fighting for his life, trying to break the rules of art. The market's obsession today just proves how thoroughly he won that fight.
The painting itself is frozen in time. It's just the world around it that shifted. And we have to remember, the intense, violent energy on those canvases wasn't just some clever intellectual theory. It was a direct reflection of the absolute chaos in his personal life. We really need to talk about his marriage to Elaine.
Yes, Elaine Freed. They met in 1938 at a Manhattan cafeteria. She was only 20 years old, and he was 34.
Okay.
She was actually deeply familiar with his artwork before they even formally met, which set up a very specific dynamic from the start. He began teaching her drawing and painting in his loft on West 21st Street.
And from the sources, it sounds like he was an incredibly harsh mentor.
Brutal is a better word. He would demand that she draw a figure or a still life with absolute, accurate linear definition, supported by meticulous shading.
And if she didn't?
If it wasn't perfect, he would literally tear her drawings to pieces in front of her, forcing her to start over and strive for absolute grace and precision.
Why would she tolerate that? That sounds emotionally exhausting.
Because she recognized his genius, and she was fiercely ambitious herself. They were married in 1943. But, if anyone is picturing a quiet, romantic, domestic life, you have to throw that out the window entirely.
Not exactly a white picket fence.
No. Their marriage was defined by severe poverty, tiny claustrophobic living spaces, massive egos, and really crippling alcoholism.
Not to mention the fact that it was an aggressively open marriage.
Very aggressively. They were entirely casual about sex and about each other's affairs. And what is wild is how deeply intertwined their romantic lives were with their professional survival.
How so?
Well, Elaine had affairs with Harold Rosenberg, the highly influential critic who we just mentioned, championing Willem's work. She had an affair with Thomas B. Hess, the managing editor for Art News, and Charles Egan, the gallery owner who gave Willem his crucial first solo show.
Oh, wow. So she is navigating the highest tiers of the New York art world, arguably leveraging these relationships to build up his career as much as her own. But Willem wasn't exactly sitting at home waiting for her, was he?
No, not at all. He had numerous affairs of his own. He had a long-term romance with a woman named Joan Ward, which resulted in a daughter, Lisa, in 1956.
Oh, yeah.
He also had a highly publicized affair with Ruth Kligman. And famously, that began right after her relationship with Jackson Pollock ended, when Pollock died in that tragic car crash. The incestuous nature of this social circle is just hard to overstate.
So how are we supposed to interpret this dynamic? Because looking at it from the outside, it reads like a mutually destructive codependency fueled by alcohol and poverty.
Right.
But on the other hand, was this actually a brutally honest avant-garde partnership? Like, did they accept each other's massive flaws and infidelities simply because the only thing that actually mattered to either of them was pushing the boundaries of their art?
I think the truth sits right in the messy middle. The destruction and the creation fed off each other. The chaos of their marriage provided the emotional friction that ended up on the canvas.
That makes sense.
But it wasn't sustainable. They finally separated in 1957, largely because they were both drowning in their respective battles with alcoholism. Elaine stayed in New York to fight through the poverty, and Willem moved out to Long Island, where he battled severe depression.
But they kept painting. And the most complicated part of this love story is that despite living apart for nearly 20 years, they never divorced.
Exactly. They couldn't live together, but they fundamentally couldn't exist without the idea of each other. They eventually reunited in 1976, older, a bit more sober, and lived out their final years together.
Which brings us to the final chapter of his life. And this era introduces a profound medical and philosophical mystery about the very nature of art.
It really does. In the late 1980s, rumors started circulating in the art world. It was eventually revealed that de Kooning was suffering from severe memory loss. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
Wow.
Yet, despite his rapidly declining cognitive function, he continued to paint in his studio every day until 1991. He lived out his final years quietly, passing away in 1997 at the age of 92.
The fact that he was still producing large-scale paintings while his memory evaporated, that sparked a massive ongoing debate among scholars, critics, and neurologists.
Oh, a huge debate.
The central question being, if the mind is failing, who or what is actually painting the canvas?
It divides the art world to this day. His late paintings look drastically different from the violent, dense Woman series. They are smooth, sparse, with these floating, ribbon-like lines of primary colors over white backgrounds. They are serene.
Almost the opposite of his earlier work.
Exactly. And some critics argued these paintings lack the critical tension, the aggressive engineering of his earlier masterpieces. They suggest that assistants were mixing his paints, placing the brushes in his hands, and that the work was essentially compromised.
Think of it like a computer where the central operating system is failing. The screen is glitching, the hard drive is wiped, but a core background program just keeps running on a loop, generating output.
That's a great way to put it.
If the conscious intent, the intellectual decision to place a line here or scrape paint there is gone, is it the artist making choices? Or is it just the pure mechanical muscle memory of the machine?
That analogy hits the nail on the head because it forces us to ask what art actually is. Is art the intellectual premeditated concept before the brush ever touches the canvas? Or is art the physical somatic act of expression?
Right.
Because even as his mind faded, the physical need to drag paint across his surface remained intact. Other critics look at those late paintings and argue they aren't compromised at all. They see them as a serene, beautiful distillation of a lifetime of movement, stripped of all the anxiety and ego of his youth.
What an unbelievable arc. You have a guy who starts out doing manual labor on ships and Hoboken houses just to afford food.
Yeah.
He navigates a brutal, impoverished art scene, becomes the most famous painter in the world, shatters the rules of representation, lives a life of absolute romantic and personal chaos, and then ends his journey painting from a place of pure, unthinking instinct as his memory quietly fades to white.
When you zoom out and look at all the source material, a distinct through line emerges here. De Kooning's life is the ultimate proof that true innovation usually requires being a total outsider.
Yeah, literally.
He was a literal stowaway. He didn't fit into the neat, traditional boxes of the European academies or American realism. He used his lack of belonging, his profound personal chaos, to forcefully break apart the canvas. Because he couldn't be categorized by the establishment, he forced the world to create a new category just for him.
And for anyone listening right now, I think that is the most powerful takeaway. Sometimes abandoning your original practical plan, like sneaking onto a boat with dreams of being a pulp illustrator and just fully embracing the terrifying unknown, is exactly how you leave a lasting mark.
Absolutely.
You use the tools you have, even if it's just cheap house paint or a single snare drum, and you figure out how to make some noise.
It requires an immense, almost reckless amount of bravery to look at hundreds of years of entrenched artistic tradition, face down the poverty and the critics, and say, no, I'm going to do it this way.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with one final provocative thought to mull over. We talked earlier about the core philosophy of abstract expressionism, of action painting.
Right.
The entire goal was to abandon traditional premeditated rules in order to capture pure, spontaneous emotion and raw physical gesture. If that is the true ultimate goal of the movement, could it be argued that de Kooning's final paintings, created while he was suffering from Alzheimer's, stripped entirely of conscious memory, overthinking, and ego, are actually the purest, most undiluted examples of option painting he ever produced? It's something to think about the next time you picture a desperate stowaway, hiding in the dark of a freighter, completely unaware that he is about to change the world.